Hey guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch Farm, and today we're going to talk about growing one of my favorite flowers in the garden, which are zinnias. Zinnias? Zinnias? Zinnias. Quick story time. When I first started the farm, I had very little clue of what I was doing. And I started a lot of my seeds inside, including ones that really have no business being started inside or don't need to be started inside. And one of those was zinnias. And there were a lot of problems that came out of that, but I also learned a lot from that. And since then, my zinnia growing game has definitely stepped up. Last year, I did an entire hedge of zinnias along the front of our property near the street, and people loved stopping by and talking about it. So the great thing about learning what I did about zinnias, and we'll get into it here in a second, but is that it really informed how I started growing zinnias. So I started all of my zinnias indoors. First of all, I was not the gardener then that I am now. And remember that gardening is a journey. I started out using those little biodegradable peat pucks that you rehydrate and then they puff up, and supposedly that little netting around the outside breaks down. Well, that's not the case. And if you've ever used those little peat pods, as I think they're Jiffy or something, and you rehydrate them and you plant them, you'll find that oftentimes you're pulling those up at the end of the year and all that netting is still there. It does not biodegrade like it says it does. If it does, it takes a long time. And so that was mistake number one, was using those. They just never performed that well. I found that the roots got tangled in them. So obviously now we soil block and we're growing in our wood trays. So we've come a long way from using those peat pods. The other mistake that I made was starting them inside. So starting zinnias indoors is really not necessary. In fact, they really don't like it. Zinnias don't like to have a lot of soil disturbance. They don't like to have their roots jostled a lot. They really prefer to be direct seeded. So the good news is this means that zinnias are much easier to grow than we think they are. We don't really have to start them inside. So unless you have a very short growing season like a zone 3, in which case you might want to get a jump on them inside. But so growing them from seed indoors comes with some other issues as well. Aside from the fact that they don't like a lot of root disturbance, they also don't do well with the hardening off process. So you'll find that if you start zinnias inside, often what happens is they get their first set of leaves. Once they get to that second set of leaves, they tend to be prone toward viruses. The leaves start to wilt. It's nothing you're doing wrong. It's just that zinnias don't like to be started inside. That's just it. It's just the nature of zinnias. They just don't like it. So don't feel bad if you've started zinnias from seed inside and they didn't do well. It's just one of those plants that does not like to be started inside. So the other thing that I found is that even though I hardened off those zinnias before I transplanted them out, they still had a lot of problems with transplant shock. So this is something that we can avoid by just starting them directly in the ground. So lesson number one with zinnias is that they really prefer to be direct seeded right into the ground. This is actually great because it makes them a much easier flower to grow. So versus something like snapdragons, which for me, I have to start inside about 10 weeks before our last frost, and I kind of have to baby them along. Zinnias don't need babying. In fact, they really don't like it. So starting them directly in the ground is tip number one. My second tip is another important one that you're not going to find on the back of a seed packet, which is the packet is going to tell you to start them at last frost. What I have learned is that zinnias prefer significantly warmer soil temperatures. So there are a few plants that we grow that I have found not only don't like having cold roots, but if they have cold roots, they become more prone to diseases. One of those is tomatoes. If we plant those out too early and the roots get too cold, they're more prone to things like blight. And it's the same with zinnias. So if we plant them out while the soil temperatures are still too cold, that's when we find that they're prone to powdery mildew. So powdery mildew is one of those diseases that zinnias just tend to get. It's something that they're all prone to. But for the last 3 years, we haven't had any powdery mildew in our field. My theory is that it's because we are planting them when the soil temperatures are nice and warm. So not only does that aid in germination, it helps us get a better germination rate when the soil temperatures are nice and warm, but also I do think that there is a component of it helping reduce the amount of disease that we see in our zinnia plants. So if you're looking to reduce powdery mildew, yes, of course, having good spacing is always going to help with that, but I found that even zinnias that I have planted all by themselves in the middle of nowhere will get powdery mildew. In our first season, we did successions of zinnias, and I started that first succession right at last frost, so right around the 2nd to 3rd week of May here for me in my zone 5, 6. But those ones versus the ones that I started later were the ones that were more prone to disease. So take that as you will. You can start them early if you want, but usually I find that they struggle a little bit anyway as those temperatures warm up. So better to just wait and start a little bit later. Speaking of successions, tip number 3, make sure you are succession planting your zinnias. So I like to do a succession planting about every month in the summer. So I start my first one around early to mid-June. I'll do my next one early to mid-July. And then that's pretty much it for me, because even if I start one in August, it's probably not going to bloom by the time we get frost. So for myself, I only do 2 successions of zinnias, but a lot of people, especially in longer growing zones, can do more. And if you have a nice long growing season that is frost-free, then feel free to succession plant every month. To me, planting every 2 weeks is kind of overkill. I find that we usually get a great month of blooms out of a zinnia plant. So I don't think that every 2 weeks is necessary. I find once a month is the perfect amount. Now, where do zinnias like to be planted? Tip number 4, do not plant your zinnias in soil that has been heavily amended or soil that is your best soil. Zinnias are gonna want your worst soil. So they prefer poor soils. They will take a range of soils. So they are okay with sandier soils, they're okay with clay soils. They are okay in a range of different soils, but what they don't like is too much nitrogen. So this also ties into my next tip, which is don't over fertilize your zinnias. In fact, I never fertilize my zinnias. Now, I don't really use any fertilizers anyway, but we do often apply our alfalfa fertilizer. And if you want that one, I'll link it below so you can go back and watch that video. Plants that do need a little bit more nitrogen, such as our sweet peas, those ones I often will supplement with that alfalfa fertilizer or some sheep manure, but zinnias are one that I don't fertilize at all. Not only do zinnias actually prefer less fertilizer, they also tend to be more prone to getting things like aphids if we fertilize them with nitrogen fertilizers. And this brings me to my last tip, which is watering. Now, zinnias, like I mentioned, they prefer poorer soils, while they also don't like a lot of water. And I have also found that this also ties into this powdery mildew issue. So for me, in our clay soils, I'm watering my zinnias maybe once a week if it's very, very dry and hot. And if it's cooler, I'll only water them every couple of weeks. Now, clay soil does retain moisture a little bit more, but I do find that zinnias, once they have started growing, they actually prefer a little bit of dry out in between waterings. So make sure you're letting them dry out slightly in between waterings. But while you're trying to get them germinated, because we've direct sown them, they are going to want regular water while they're still establishing. So we water pretty consistently, overhead water, just to make sure we're fully soaking the area where we've direct seeded our zinnias. Once I see that second and third set of leaves come up, I back off of the watering, and then that's when we start to let things dry out a little bit in between. I'm gonna give one more direct seeding tip. If you watched our cut flower garden plan for a 4x8 bed that is full of easy cut flowers, you may already know this tip. I like to recommend laying something over the top of the area that you're direct seeding. A layer of burlap, a layer of frost fabric will work, even a cotton sheet will work, and wet it, and then that will help retain moisture, especially if you're in a drier zone like mine, Colorado. Our springs tend to be on the dry side, it tends to be windy, and that can really dry out the surface of the soil, which is a problem if we're trying to get something direct seeded to germinate. So in that case, I direct seed, I lay my layer of either frost fabric or a sheet or some burlap on top, water over the top, and I also water underneath, and that helps to keep it nice and moist. I don't remove that sheet or frost fabric until those zinnias have that second and third set of leaf, and then I'm ready to start backing off. So not only will this help keep the birds from getting it, it'll help bunnies from nibbling on your zinnias. So it kind of knocks out a few problems that we have with direct seeding zinnias. Okay, bonus tip is pinching. So once we've gotten to that third set of leaves with our zinnias, we've direct seeded them a little bit late into nice warm soil, we've kept them moist, they've germinated, they have their third set of leaves, and we've removed that sheet or that frost fabric. Now is pinching. So pinching is optional. There are different perspectives and viewpoints on pinching. Some people say it's absolutely not necessary. Other people like to pinch. So I'll just tell you what I do, and you can do whatever you'd like. So personally, I like to pinch. I always like to illustrate the idea of pinching just because I find that people do well with a visual. I don't have a visual right now because we haven't started our zinnias yet. So instead, I'll show you here. So the idea is that by pinching, we're creating multiple branches. If we don't pinch, we'll just get a single stem. And then often zinnias will branch more as they grow. But if we pinch from down below as the seedling is growing and take off the little top part of the meristem, then we'll get branching from lower down. And that's gonna mean more flowers. So basically the reason that we're pinching is twofold: more flowers, but also longer stems. Don't judge my drawing. Here's the ground. Told you don't judge it. Here's our roots. You know what roots look like. And then here we've got our stem, first set of leaves, second set of leaves, third set of leaves. Okay, you get the idea. So once we have the third set, we're gonna come in and pinch, and literally I'm just gonna take my finger and thumb. You could use the little scissors if you'd like. I just usually like to use my nails. And we're gonna pinch right below that third set of leaves. So we're gonna take off this whole top set, and I like to pinch nice and close to that next set of leaves. And then what's gonna happen is from there, we're gonna start getting branches that are gonna be growing out like this from the base. So instead of having one that's gonna go up and then we'll cut our first flower and then we'll get branching, by pinching when they're young, we get branching earlier. So that's all my tips for growing zinnias. I'm going to give you a couple quick harvest tips as well while you're here. If you're growing zinnias for cutting, there are a couple of things that are going to help you get good vase life out of zinnias. Now, zinnias already have a pretty good vase life, but there are a couple things you should know. One is that when we are cutting our zinnias, we want to cut really nice and far down into the plant. So this might mean that you're sacrificing some side shoots. So we have branching going on if we've pinched our zinnias early on. What this means is that if we're cutting deeply into the plant, we might be sacrificing some side shoots that we're going to have to remove. It's okay to do that, because as we cut deeper into the plant, what that's going to do is create more branching from lower down. For example, if we cut our first zinnia, this is our first zinnia. Now say we have another little one right here, and we say, oh, I don't want to lose this one, so I'm going to cut this one here. What we're going to get is more branching from here that are going to be short. If we cut our first zinnia all the way back down to the bottom, so maybe here, then we're gonna get more long stems. I hope that makes sense. I usually like to say at least from my fingertip to my elbow is how long I like to cut my first zinnias. You'll also wanna give what's called the wiggle test. So when you're harvesting zinnias, you wanna grab about 6 inches down the stem and wiggle the stem back and forth gently. If the head of the bloom starts wobbling and flopping back and forth quite a bit, that means that zinnia is not ready to harvest. If as you give it the wiggle test, the stem stays nice and stiff, it is ready to harvest. So that means the zinnia is usually older. So in general, older zinnias tend to have a better vase life than the ones that just opened. So this is contrary to a lot of the flowers that we grow. Cosmos, roses are some that we really want to harvest almost before they've even opened, versus the zinnias, it's just something that is going to help them have the longest vase life. Otherwise, you might see them bending. Wiggle test, cut deep. And the last thing is, if you're doing it professionally or you're selling your zinnias, you'll want to use what's called CVBN tabs. I have found that zinnias just do best in fresh water that is changed out frequently. So if you're concerned about putting chemicals into your water, just change out the water frequently. If you're doing this professionally and you're concerned about vase life and you're selling to florists, you might want to look into CVBN tabs. You just put a little tab, it looks like a little aspirin, you drop it right into your water bucket, and that helps condition your flowers, and that way they don't brown as quickly as they do with, say, floral food, because zinnias just they don't really like flower food. Because you've watched this long, I'm also going to give you my favorite varieties. So my favorite zinnia varieties are actually not the primary colors. If you are a bright, like red, yellow lover, then the Bennery zinnias are very large. They have lots of layers of petals. They're pretty big. I mean, they can even get close to dahlia size. If you are more into the peaches and kind of the dustier colors, more antique colors, I really love those ones. Then you can look into the Queenie series. There's Queenie Red Lime is my all-time favorite. Queenie Peach is beautiful. I'm not a huge fan of the orange ones, but a lot of people like those. And then if you really want to get special, you can look into Florette's line of bred zinnias. They are a little bit pricey, about $20 for a packet of seeds, but she has bred them all herself. But speaking of favorite varieties, I have now gotten to the point where I am saving my own seed. So if you want to save your own seed, and it's very easy to save your own seed with zinnia. However, one thing that you're going to want to know is that they will cross-pollinate. So if you have different zinnias growing in the same area, you're not always going to get a zinnia that is true to the parent. If you know that you want to get a zinnia that is true to whatever the seed is that you started with, then you're going to want to cover them with a bag before they've been pollinated. So right as they're starting to open, if I know I'm growing, for example, queen lime, and I want to save some of those seeds, then I'll put a little organza bag over the top of that bloom and cinch it tight before it has a chance to be cross-pollinated by bees or butterflies, and that way I know that they will still be true to the parent. Otherwise, I grow so many different zinnias that they often will cross-pollinate, and then I end up with something different. But that is fun too. So if you want to come up with your own zinnia varieties, try mixing and save your own seed and see what happens. Let's pop over to our zinnia field from last season, because it's not too late to save zinnias if you still have some in your garden. Let's go. Oops. Oh, you don't have to get up, girl. Just laying in the ice. So I usually leave the zinnias up for the birds because they do like to pick at the seeds, and this means we have some good examples to look at. If you're going to be saving your zinnia seed, you want to let them bloom early in the season and have time to fully develop their seeds. Otherwise, if you wait until fall and the flowers are newer, they often don't have time to develop seeds. So let's see if we can find, here's one for example. So this was one that had just bloomed when fall hit. And while you can see what looks like seeds on the inside, I'll show you here in a second that these seeds are actually not viable. There's no embryo in these seeds. Oh, maybe one here, but not many. So there's maybe a couple viable seeds here, but let's look at an older bloom. And I can tell that this one was older because there's lots of different layers in it. And if I just pull this apart here, you'll see how many viable seeds we have in here. So here you can see all the different seeds. This light part here, this was the petals. This kind of lighter, these are petals that are now bleached out by the sun. Not only are the zinnia seeds that are viable going to be darker, like this one here, this one, and usually you'll find those viable ones here near the base. This zinnia had a lot of layers of petals here, and you can see it up toward the top. It's really mostly just petals. These aren't viable seeds, although if you pull out these petals, usually the viable seeds are attached. Usually those more viable seeds are going to be down at the base because those were the first petals to emerge, and so they've had more time to develop into seeds. And so here you can see some of those ones that were down there toward the base, and they have developed viable seed, and they're plumper, they're larger, they have this little line down the center. These ones are going to be viable versus if I pull some of the ones from the top, look at the difference. They're lighter in color, they're thinner, oops. So the ones down toward the base are the viable ones. Those ones that were up at the top that are kind of thin and bendy, they don't feel plump, those ones are not viable. So just a quick tutorial on zinnia seed harvesting. If you really want to get into zinnia seed saving and growing your own varieties and breeding, I'm going to attach a link to a book that you might be interested in here down below. All right guys, I hope you're feeling motivated to grow some more zinnias this year, start saving your own seed, and to really enjoy seeing all the pollinators that come into the garden when you're growing zinnias. Not only are they actually pretty easy and low maintenance, they attract a ton of beneficial insects and pollinators to the gardens. Let me know what varieties you're going to be growing this year. I'd love to hear it. And if you have any questions, pop them down below. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time at the farm.